All right, so welcome in everyone to this evening gathering of practitioners. Um, some of us are Buddhists, some of us are just meditators, but there is a kind of unifying factor this evening for anyone who is really on the path of goodness, on the path of taking care of others, taking care of themselves in a meaningful way. And that unifying factor is, of course, the recent passing of Thich Nhat Hanh. Some people here may not be particularly familiar with who Thich Nhat Hanh was, who Thich Nhat Hanh is. But he's really one of the best examples we've had in the modern era of a living saint, someone who embodies the Buddha's teachings and embodies enlightenment, compassion, kindness to the greatest degree. And not only that, but was able to communicate and connect that enlightenment, that compassion, that peace with possibly more people than anyone has since the time of the Buddha, since the Buddha himself. So it's really a great loss, but also a great opportunity for awakening, for transformation, for understanding the value of life, the preciousness of being alive right now. So this evening is going to kind of be a bit of a memorial, a remembering, a celebration of a Thich Nhat Hanh. So we'll do a short mindfulness practice together. And then we will read together from the first chapter. We will read the entire first chapter of Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming, excuse me, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering. So we're going to read the full first chapter of that book. And while Thich Nhat Hanh was a Buddhist monk, his wisdom was not Buddhist. His wisdom was enlightenment, compassion, peace, and just like the title of this book says, transforming suffering. So we really all have a really wonderful opportunity this evening to grow, to learn, to transform our suffering, not in a religious way, but in a way that is direct, understandable, and quite beautiful as well. So we are gathered in person. We have about more people than usual. We have about 5 people here at the center. We have about 25 people in the Discord group call. We have 11 people watching through YouTube, and we have over 100 listening on Reddit. So it's a really sincere gathering of people, and it's all thanks to Thich Nhat Hanh. So let's take advantage of this opportunity, this gift of mindfulness, this gift of being present right now. And we'll start that with a short meditation, starting with the sound of the bell. Thich Nhat Hanh often gave a teaching about inviting the bell, and the sound of the bell being a reminder to return to the breath, return to the body, return to this enlightenment mind. this peace mind that is accessible to us at any moment. It's just a matter of listening, putting down our distractions, our confusions, our delusions, beliefs, stories about what's going on, and just listening, just touching into peace at this moment. So as we listen to the sound of the bell, allow it to invite us to meditation, not in a complicated way, not in a spiritual way, but just listening. Opening up our whole body and mind, our whole heart to the sound of the bell, to the feeling of the breath flowing into the body and flowing out, to awareness of our whole body at this moment. So we can all close our eyes if we are comfortable to do so. And as we hear the sound of the bell, we can practice this deep listening, deep breathing, being aware of our body and mind. Utilizing our breath as this anchor into the present moment. Being fully aware, fully present, fully alive at this moment. Even if you aren't skillful in meditation, simply allow this time to be a touching into your own sincerity, your own heart, to be in the present, to be with the breath, to be aware of this beautiful, precious body. To give your full attention to the body at this moment. Our body is so precious to us. When our body is hurt or sick, we are so sad. We are in so much pain. When our body is healthy, feeling pleasure, we feel so happy, so joyous. But so often we completely neglect our body. We completely forget that we have a body. So at this moment, not forgetting. At this moment, with each and every breath, with each and every sound, with each and every moment, remembering this body. So often it is our desires for happiness, our idea of happiness, our chasing after happiness that totally prevents us from experiencing happiness right here, right now. Simply through breathing and being aware of the body, giving our full attention to the body, we can touch into a peace, a safety, a happiness that does not rely on anything or anyone outside of us. A happiness that arises simply from our being aware, being fully alive and connected to our aliveness at this moment. So we can open our eyes if we have them closed. take a moment to make sure that we are comfortable, sitting or laying in a comfortable way. And we're now going to celebrate, remember, bring up the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, this living Buddha who recently passed away, who changed form. Thich Nhat Hanh would say that there really is no birth, no death. There is just a changing of form, a changing of energy, a changing of the way that we appear in the world. So even though Thich Nhat Hanh's body is no longer breathing, his physical heart is no longer beating, he is very much alive. And we are about to enjoy his aliveness, his richness, his wisdom, his compassion together. So take a moment to make sure that you are comfortable and warm. We're going to read through the full first chapter of Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering. You can listen to it as a meditation, seating upright, or you can lay down and listen to it as a lullaby. The good effects will be there no matter what. So I will take a moment to put a few more pieces of wood on the fire, and then we will begin with our reading of Thich Nhat Hanh. Also, for anyone who is listening or watching, we are also live on video. We are live streaming on YouTube. So make sure that if you want to see the visual component of our memorial ceremony of Thich Nhat Hanh, if you want to connect in that way, you're very welcome to join us on YouTube live. So, Nhat Hanh's book, No Mud, No Lotus. This is one of the first books that I used as a kind of teaching tool to guide people through getting an introduction to Buddhist teachings. And it's also a book that I adamantly and consistently recommend for people to read, especially people who are not necessarily into religion, not necessarily Buddhist. Maybe they're not even into meditation or anything along those lines. But this book, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering, has such a rich, direct, and accessible teaching. And so we'll now begin to read through that book, the first chapter from Thich Nhat Hanh. Chapter 1, The Art of Transforming Suffering. We all want to be happy, and there are many books and teachers in the world that try to help people be happier. Yet we all continue to suffer. Therefore, we may think that we are doing it wrong. Somehow we are failing at happiness. That isn't true. Being able to enjoy happiness doesn't require that we have zero suffering. In fact, the art of happiness is also the art of suffering well. When we learn to acknowledge, embrace, and understand our suffering, we suffer much less. Not only that, but we are also able to go further and transform our suffering into understanding, compassion, and joy for ourselves and for others. One of the most difficult things for us to accept is that there is no realm where there is only happiness and there is no suffering. This doesn't mean that we should despair. Suffering can be transformed. As soon as we open our mouth to say suffering, we know that the opposite of suffering is already there as well. Where there is suffering, there is happiness. According to the creation story in the biblical book of Genesis, God said, "Let there be light." I like to imagine that light replied, saying, "God, I have to wait for my twin brother, darkness, to be with me. I cannot be there without the darkness." God asked, "Why do you need to wait? Darkness is there." Light answered, "In that case, then I am also already there." If we focus exclusively on pursuing happiness, we may regard suffering as something to be ignored or resisted. We think of it as something that gets in the way of happiness. But the art of happiness is also and at the same time the art of knowing how to suffer well. If we know how to use our suffering, we can transform it and suffer much less. Knowing how to suffer well is essential to realizing true happiness. Suffering and happiness are not separate. When we suffer, we tend to think that suffering is all there is at that moment, and happiness belongs to some other time or place. People often ask, "Why do I have to suffer?" Thinking we should be able to have a life without any suffering is as deluded as thinking we should be able to have a left side without a right side. The same is true of thinking we have a life in which no happiness whatsoever is to be found. If the left says, right, you have to go away, I don't want you, I only want the left, that is nonsense. Because then the left would have to stop existing as well. If there is no right, then there is no left. Where there is no suffering, there can be no happiness either, and vice versa. If we can learn to see and skillfully engage with both the presence of happiness and the presence of suffering, we will go in the direction of enjoying life more. Every day we go a little farther in that direction, and eventually we realize that suffering and happiness are not two separate things. Cold air can be painful if you aren't wearing enough warm clothes. But when you're feeling overheated, or you're walking outside with proper clothing, the bracing sensation of cold air can be a source of feeling joy and aliveness. Suffering isn't some kind of external, objective source of oppression and pain. There might be things that cause you to suffer, such as loud music or bright lights, which may bring other people joy. There are things that bring you joy that annoy other people. The rainy day that ruins your plans for a picnic is a boon for the farmer whose field is parched. Happiness is possible right now, today. But happiness cannot be without suffering. Some people think that in order to be happy, they must avoid all suffering, and so they are constantly vigilant, constantly worrying. They end up sacrificing all their spontaneity, freedom, and joy. This isn't correct. If you can recognize and accept your pain without running away from it, you will discover that although pain is there, joy can also be there at the same time. Some say that suffering is only an illusion, or that to live wisely we have to transcend both suffering and joy. I say the opposite. The way to suffer well and be happy is to stay in touch with what is actually going on. In doing so, you will gain liberating insights into the true nature of suffering and of joy. So periodically, as we are going through this reading, I will ring the bell, and that will be this invitation to come back to our mindfulness, to our awareness of the body, to really being in the present right now at this moment. No mud, no lotus. Both suffering and happiness are of an organic nature, which means they are both transitory. They are always changing. The flower, when it wilts, becomes the compost. The compost can help grow a flower again. Happiness is also organic and impermanent by nature. It can become suffering, and suffering can become happiness again. If you look deeply into a flower, you see that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. In that flower there is a cloud. Of course, we know a cloud isn't a flower, but without a cloud, a flower cannot be. If there is no cloud, there is no rain, and no flower can grow. You don't have to be a dreamer to see a cloud floating in a flower. It's really there. Sunlight is also there. Sunlight isn't a flower, but without sunlight, no flower is possible. If we continue to look deeply into the flower, we see many other things, like the earth and the minerals. Without them, a flower cannot be. So it's a fact that a flower is made only of non-flower elements. A flower cannot be by herself alone. A flower can only interbe with everything else. You can't remove the sunlight, the soil, or the cloud from the flower. In each of our Plum Village practice centers around the world, we have a lotus pond. Everyone knows we need to have mud for lotuses to grow. The mud doesn't smell so good, but the lotus flower smells very good. If you don't have mud, the lotus won't manifest. You can't grow lotus flowers on marble. Without mud, there can be no lotus. It is possible, of course, to get stuck in the mud of life. It's easy enough to notice mud all over you at times. The hardest thing to practice is not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed by despair. When you are overwhelmed by despair, all you can see is suffering everywhere you look. You feel as if the worst thing is happening to you. But we must remember that suffering is a kind of mud that we need in order to generate joy and happiness. Without suffering, there is no happiness. So we shouldn't discriminate against the mud. We have to learn how to embrace and cradle our own suffering and the suffering of the world with a lot of tenderness. When I lived in Vietnam during the war, it was difficult to see our way through that dark and heavy mud. It seemed like the destruction would just go on and on forever. Every day people would ask me if I thought the war would end soon. It was very difficult to answer because there was no end in sight. But I knew if I said, "I don't know," that would only water their seeds of despair. So when people asked me that question, I replied, "Everything is impermanent, even war. It will end someday." Knowing that, we could continue to work for peace. And indeed, the war did end. Now the former mortal enemies are busily trading and touring back and forth, and people throughout the world enjoy practicing our tradition's teachings on mindfulness and peace. If you know how to make good use of the mud, you can grow beautiful lotuses. If you know how to make good use of suffering, you can produce happiness. We do need some suffering to make happiness possible. And most of us have enough suffering inside and around us to be able to do that. We don't have to create any more. Did the Buddha suffer? When I was a young monk, I believed that the Buddha didn't suffer once he had become enlightened. Naively, I asked myself, what's the use of becoming a Buddha if you continue to suffer? The Buddha did suffer because he had a body, feelings, and perceptions like all of us. Sometimes he probably had a headache. Sometimes he suffered from rheumatism. If he happened to eat something not well cooked, then he had intestinal problems. So he suffered physically, and he suffered emotionally as well. When one of his beloved students died, he suffered. How can you not suffer when a dear friend has just died? The Buddha wasn't a stone. He was a human being. But because he had a lot of insight, wisdom, and compassion, he knew how to suffer, and so he suffered much less. The Four Noble Truths. The very first teaching the Buddha gave after his enlightenment was about suffering. It's called the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha's Four Noble Truths are: there is suffering. There is a course of action that generates suffering. Suffering ceases, i.e., there is happiness. And there is a course of action leading to the ending of suffering, the arising of happiness. When you first hear that suffering is a noble truth, you might wonder what is so noble about suffering. The Buddha was saying that if we can recognize suffering, and if we can embrace it and look deeply into its roots, then we will be able to let go of the habits that feed it, and at the same time find a way to happiness. Suffering has its beneficial aspects. It can be an excellent teacher. What suffering is made of? There is the suffering of the body, including the sensations of pain, illness, hunger, and physical injury. Some of this suffering is simply unavoidable. Then there is the suffering of the mind, including anxiety, jealousy, despair, fear, and anger. We have the seeds, the potential in us for understanding, love, compassion, and insight, as well as the seeds of anger, hate, and greed. While we can't avoid all the suffering in life, we can suffer much less by not watering the seeds of suffering inside us. Are you at war with your body? Do you neglect or punish your body? Have you truly gotten to know your body? Can you feel at home with your body? Suffering can be either physical or mental or both. But every kind of suffering manifests somewhere in the body and creates tension and stress. We are told that we should release the tension in our body. Many of us have tried very hard. We want to release the tension in our body, but we can't release it. Our attempts at reducing tension in us won't work unless we first acknowledge that it's there. When you cut your finger, you just wash it, and your body knows how to heal. When a non-human animal living in the forest is injured, she knows what to do. She stops searching for something to eat or looking for a mate. She knows through generations of ancestral knowledge that it's not good for her to do so. She finds a quiet place and just lies down, doing nothing. Non-human animals instinctively know that stopping is the best way to get healed. They don't need a doctor, a drugstore, or a pharmacist. We human beings used to have this kind of wisdom, but we have lost touch with it. We don't know how to rest anymore. We don't allow the body to rest, to release the tension and heal. We rely almost entirely on medication to deal with sickness and pain. Yet the most effective ways to ease and transform our suffering are already available to us without any prescription and at no financial cost. I'm not suggesting that you should throw away all your medications. Some of us do need to use certain medicines, but we can sometimes use them in smaller quantities and to much greater effect when we know how to let our body and mind truly rest. Healing medicine. The main affliction of our modern civilization is that we don't know how to handle the suffering inside us, and we try to cover it up with all kinds of consumption. Retailers peddle a plethora of classic and novel devices to help us cover up the suffering inside. But unless and until we are able to face our suffering, we can't be present and available to life, and happiness will continue to elude us. There are many people who have enormous suffering and don't know how to handle it. For many people, it starts already at a very young age. So why don't schools teach our young people the way to manage suffering? If a student is very unhappy, they can't concentrate and they can't learn. The suffering of each of us affects others. The more we learn about the art of suffering well, the less suffering there will be in the world. Mindfulness is the best way to be with our suffering without being overwhelmed by it. Mindfulness is the capacity to dwell in the present moment, to know what's happening in the here and now. For example, when we are lifting our two arms, we are conscious of the fact that we are lifting our arms. Our mind is with lifting our arms, and we don't think about the past or the future, because lifting our arms is what's happening in the present moment. To be mindful means to be aware. It is the energy that knows what is happening in the present moment. Lifting our arms and knowing that we are lifting our arms, that is mindfulness, mindfulness of our action. When we breathe in and we know we are breathing in, that is mindfulness. When we make a step and we know that the steps are taking place, we are mindful of the steps. Mindfulness is always mindfulness of something. It's the energy that helps us be aware of what is happening right now and right here, in our body, in our feelings, in our perceptions, and around us. With mindfulness, you can recognize the presence of the suffering in you and in the world. And it's with that same energy that you tenderly embrace the suffering. By being aware of your in-breath and out-breath, you generate the energy of mindfulness, so you can continue to cradle the suffering. Practitioners of mindfulness can help and support each other in recognizing, embracing, and transforming suffering. With mindfulness, we are no longer afraid of pain. We can even go further and make good use of suffering to generate the energy of understanding and compassion that heals us, and we can help others to heal and be happy as well. Generating mindfulness. The way we start producing the medicine of mindfulness is by stopping and taking a conscious breath. Giving our complete attention to our in-breath and our out-breath. When we stop and take a breath in this way, we unite body and mind and come back home to ourselves. We feel our bodies more fully. We are truly alive only when the mind is with the body. The great news is that oneness of body and mind can be realized just by one in-breath. Maybe we have not been kind enough to our body for some time. Recognizing the tension, the pain, the stress in our body, we can bathe it in our mindful awareness. And that is the beginning of healing. If we take care of the suffering inside us, we have more clarity, energy, and strength to help address the suffering, violence, poverty, and inequity of our loved ones, as well as the suffering in our community and the world. If, however, we are preoccupied with the fear and despair in us, we can't help remove the suffering of others. There is an art to suffering well. If we know how to take care of our suffering, we not only suffer much, much less, we also create more happiness around us and in the world. So that is chapter 1 of Thich Nhat Hanh's book, No Mud, No Lotus, The Art of Transforming Suffering. At this moment, we can be fully aware of our breath, fully aware of our body, fully aware of our ability and our willingness to be with suffering. I know for myself that Thich Nhat Hanh's wish in this world was to not only end his own suffering, but to alleviate the suffering of others. And not only to teach people to alleviate, to reduce, to heal their own suffering, but also to teach them, to encourage them, to guide them, to heal the suffering of others. So if we take responsibility for our suffering, if we are willing to be with it, to take care of our suffering, then for sure we can heal ourselves. And as we heal ourselves, we have a greater and greater ability to take care of others, to heal others, to honor and celebrate every day, every moment, the wonderful teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh. We can take a few moments to sit together in silence, to sit together in mindfulness, not all in the same room together, but also in no way separate, in no way distant, practicing mindfulness together at this moment. So to finish our gathering today, our remembering of Thich Nhat Hanh, our celebration of Thich Nhat Hanh's continuation in his teachings, in the peace and wisdom that continue to flow from him, and through all of us. We will finish with a chanting of the Heart Sutra, his translation, Thich Nhat Hanh's, often called Te by his students, teacher. We'll finish with a chanting of the Heart Sutra that is very often chanted in his practice centers throughout the world, in France, in California, in New York. Thich Nhat Hanh has these centers of practice all over the world. So I invite everyone to join me in chanting this. I imagine you don't have a copy of it in front of you, but you can listen from the heart and follow along with me in that way. Just going to pull up a copy of this. I don't have this memorized. Okay. Great. And the Heart Sutra is a kind of very deep teaching about Zen. It's not something that's entry level, so you may not be able to understand some of it, but just to listen deeply, to listen from the heart, and hopefully some of this deep, rich, meaningful, healing wisdom will connect with you as I chant this. And later on, I'll share a copy of this this chant with everyone who's here. Maha Prajna Paramita Heart Sutra. Chanting of the insight that brings us to the other shore. Avalokiteshvara, while practicing deeply with the insight that brings us to the other shore, suddenly discovered that all of the five skandhas are equally empty. And with this realization, she overcame all ill-being. Listen, Shariputra, this body is itself emptiness, and emptiness itself is this body. This body is not other than emptiness, and emptiness is not other than this body. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Listen, Shariputra, all phenomena bear the mark of emptiness. Their true nature is the nature of no birth, no death, no being, no non-being, no defilement, no purity, no increasing, no decreasing. This is why in emptiness, body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are not separate self-entities. The 18 realms of phenomena, which are the 6 sense organs, the 6 sense objects, and the 6 consciousnesses, are also not separate self-entities. The 12 links of interdependent arising and their extinction are also not separate self-entities. Ill-being, the causes of ill-being, the end of ill-being, the path, insight, and attainment are also not separate self-entities. Whoever can see this no longer needs anything to attain. Bodhisattvas who practice the insight that brings us to the other shore see no more obstacles in their mind. And because there are no more obstacles in their mind, they can overcome all fear, destroy all wrong perceptions, and realize perfect nirvana. All Buddhas in the past, present, and future, by practicing the insight that brings us to the other shore, are all capable of attaining authentic and perfect enlightenment. Therefore, Shariputra, it should be known that the insight that brings us to the other shore is the great mantra, the most illuminating mantra, the highest mantra, a mantra beyond compare, the true wisdom that has the power to put an end to all kinds of suffering. Therefore, let us proclaim a mantra to praise the insight that brings us to the other shore. Gate, gate, para, gate, para, samgate, bodhisvaha. Gate, gate, para, gate, para, samgate, bodhisvaha. Gate, gate, para, gate, para, samgate, bodhisvaha. Okay, so I want to express my great thanks and appreciation to Thich Nhat Hanh for all of his teachings, for all of his wisdom that he has brought to me in helping me to heal my suffering and also to help other people heal their suffering. So I dedicate and we all can dedicate the merits, the benefits, the wholesomeness from this practice together, from this gathering together to Thich Nhat Hanh's continuation, to the continuation of peace, the continuation of the insight that brings us to the other shore, the wisdom of transforming suffering. So as we finally finish, I will just like to play for everyone a much more beautiful, well-sung rendition of the Heart Sutra from his community. So I'll just play that through the audio, and we can sit together and listen to that. And then we'll end our gathering with the 3 sadhus after that's over. Okay, so we can all listen to this beautiful chanting of the Heart Sutra, and then we will end our coming together.
Inside that brings us to the other shore. Inside that brings us to the other shore. Suddenly discover that all of the 5 sanghas are equally empty, and with this realization he overcame all in being. Living Jai Putra, its body itself is emptiness, and emptiness itself is body. Its body is not other. Emptiness and emptiness is not other. And its body, the same is true of feelings, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Little Jai Putra. Emptiness that true nature is the nature of no birth, no death, no being, no unbeing, no defilement, no purity, no increasing, no decreasing. That is why in emptiness, body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are not separate self-entities.
Okay. So thank you everyone for being here this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Um, just want to say thank you to Thich Nhat Hanh. Thank you to everyone for being here. This will be the official ending of our memorial celebration ceremony. For those who would like to stick around for a little bit longer, um, you're welcome to stay and sit with me in remembering Thich Nhat Hanh and practicing mindfulness for about another 15 minutes or so. But this will be the official end, and then I'll just ring a bell at the end of the sitting period. So thank you for joining, everyone. Take a good care of yourself, and remember Thich Nhat Hanh. He never is so far away. all beings be well, happy, and peaceful. Thank you for joining. Good night.